In the headlines this hour, the UN says more than 3 million refugees have now fled from Ukraine to neighbouring countries. We hear from some of those who've escaped the conflict.
I want the war to end now, and I don't want to go anywhere.
People in the Donbass remain trapped in a war zone, with estimates claiming around 85% of Volnovakha housing has been damaged during the strikes. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has slammed Joe Biden for unacceptable rhetoric after he branded the Russian president a war criminal. It comes after some US senators even called for President Putin to be taken out. From Moscow to the world, this is RT International. I'm Peter Scott, and these are the top stories this hour. A third week of the conflict in Ukraine is raging as a theatre sheltering potentially hundreds of people is bombed in the city of Mariupol. The incident leads to a blame game, with Ukraine accusing Russian forces of the atrocity, while Moscow says the building's never been a target and accuses the neo-Nazi Azov battalion of a provocation. There's no verification of how many people were in the building when it was hit. Now, these are pictures from Kharkov, where 3 residential buildings were damaged by airstrikes. A school was also hit by the shelling, and rescue efforts are underway. More than 3 million refugees have now fled Ukraine, according to the United Nations, and 240,000 people have evacuated to Russia since the conflict started. Many more have arrived in Moldova, Poland and Slovakia, and here's how some of them describe their plight.
I want the war to end now, and I don't want to go anywhere. Because there are my parents, my husband who protects us.
It's so difficult for us because we must go to another countries to save our lives and lives our parents.
We pray that indeed God will stop everything. Only in Him now we have hope. We believe everything will be fine.
People living in the Donbass republics remain trapped in a war zone, suffering from airstrikes and fighting. Now, Russia sent 450 tons of food and basic necessities to Mariupol residents so far, but Russia's defense ministry claims nationalist fighters are preventing it from being handed out and blocking the evacuation of locals. Now, these are pictures from the city of Volnovakha, where locals are now receiving humanitarian aid and food packages from Donetsk authorities. Local officials say around 85% of the city's housing has been damaged. Earlier, the Russian military took control of the Kakhovskaya electric power station. A new humanitarian corridor for refugees has been set up there, as the station is one of the only crossings over the Dnieper River. Next, we head to another town in the Kherson region where life there is slowly returning to normal. Novaya Kakhovka has spared hostilities, but the conflict has still led to vital shortages, making every day a struggle for locals. With more, here's RT's Murad Gazdiev.
Along the river Dnieper, in towns and cities that were spared fighting and have been liberated by Russian troops, life is slowly returning to an approximation of normality. This is Novaya Kakhovka. At the mayor's office, the Russian and Ukrainian flags fly together, and all efforts are being made to get this community back on its feet.
Almost all the infrastructure is being restored, though we're facing quite a lot of difficulties. First of all, a lack of medicine is our biggest problem. We also have a shortage of fuel, and the planting season is almost here. We don't have a day to lose, but we need seeds, fertilizers and pesticides.
The Ukrainian economy is dependent on agriculture. It is one of the world's biggest exporters of wheat, grains and other foodstuffs. But to reap, they must sow, even at this time. Thankfully, fighting passed Novaya Kakhovka by, but its ravages are acutely felt.
Are we living here? We're rather surviving, thank God. I have little cash left. My pension was transferred to my bank card, but there's nowhere I can withdraw it. We don't have much work here. Everything is stalled.
Changes are already here. Russian television and broadcasting have returned. For years, the Ukrainian government had attempted to deny its population any access to Russian news and even blocked almost all Russian social media websites in an effort to reduce any exposure to Russian views or alternative opinions.
All the information we get has been distorted. I'm an old person, and even I can recognize the lies we are fed on Ukrainian television.
Change is painful, especially for a people who have lived under nationalist tyranny and thought police for years. They fear expressing themselves, lest someone hears.
If this all had happened back in 2014, when they burned people in Odessa, it would have been different now. Russians would have been welcomed here. But now, people have become zombified. What's white for me is black for them.
A lot of people here waiting in line for humanitarian aid. The situation is tense, and it is such that not everyone wants to be filmed on camera. I would say the majority don't. They have no confidence in tomorrow. They don't know what will happen if they say something someone doesn't like on camera. Perhaps nationalists will appear at their doorstep that evening or this evening and, cause problems for them. People have disappeared before. Initially, people didn't know what to expect. Ukrainian media had fed its population lies about mass rape and murder by Russian troops. When the people learned that it was all fear-mongering and untrue, they calmed down, but not the nationalists. A small but loud, aggressive and relentless part of the population, which has bullied the masses for years, tries to re-establish its dominance. Morad Gazdiev from Novaya Kakhovka, Ukraine.
In the meantime, the Kremlin has slammed US President Joe Biden for what it calls unacceptable rhetoric. That's after the US president called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. He was speaking to reporters following a White House event on Wednesday, and initially the American leader seemed reluctant to use the term, but then apparently had a change of heart.
Mr. President, after everything we've seen, are you ready to call Putin a war criminal?
No.
Are you ready to meet with him?
I think he is a war criminal.
Will you be meeting with him?
And with mass outrage over Russia's actions in Ukraine, any dissenting or challenging voices in the US media are increasingly being branded as traitors or, even worse, Russian agents. Former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard was recently censored for allegedly being offensive and inappropriate to some audiences, according to YouTube. Now, as you watch that video, you'll see a warning from YouTube appear and a filter stating, quote, "The following content has been identified by the YouTube community as inappropriate or offensive to some audiences. However, you can still click through and the content will be played."
This war machine, this power elite in Washington, they want to turn Ukraine into another Afghanistan, turn into these killing fields where this long-term insurgency is supported, and they bleed out and cripple, kill as many Russians as possible for who knows how long. And they're really showing their real aim in the fact that they're not taking action right now to end this conflict.
Despite the anger being aimed at some US politicians for speaking their minds, it seems it's okay for senators to call for Vladimir Putin to be taken out, drawing parallels with attempts in Germany in the 1930s to assassinate Adolf Hitler.
Do you still stand by your call to have Putin be assassinated? Do you still stand by your call?
Yeah, I hope he'll be taken out one way or the other. I don't care how they take him out. I don't care if we send him to The Hague and try him. I just want him to go. He's a war criminal. I wish somebody had taken Hitler out in the 30s.
Well, former US Marine Corps intelligence officer Scott Ritter still believes it's not too late for Washington to return to diplomacy if it avoids such rhetoric towards Russia.
Well, I just think it's extremely inappropriate for the leader of the United States to, throw out an accusation like that to the leader of of a sovereign state, especially one that enjoys the status of Russia, a global power. The United States has a choice. It can either continue down the path towards confrontation with Russia, which, if it reaches its final culminating moment, will mean the end of the world as we know it, or it can choose diplomacy. Anytime a nation goes to war with another nation, it means that the global framework of international law is broken down. This isn't like, the Russian president and Russian leadership woke up one night and said, oh, we're just going to invade Ukraine. This has been a problem that's 15 years in the making, where we knew that if we continued to pressure Russia, that this would be the outcome. The goal of, in pushing back Russia, we have several objectives. One, the number one option is to compel a fight in Ukraine, to create the conditions that force Russia to invade Ukraine, and then we can hold Russia in Ukraine and bleed them dry. Right now in the United States, we're suppressing freedom of speech, we're suppressing debate, and this leads to a one-sided discussion where, we don't know what the ground truth is. We're not considering all the facts. Therefore, we're being pushed towards policy considerations that may not be the best policies for a peaceful diplomatic outcome.
Such is the anger at Moscow's military action. Ukraine's defense minister has referred to Russians as orcs, of course referencing the fantasy monsters, while another of the country's top public figures has even called for a massacre of the Russian people. Here's RT's Paula Slier with more.
There was a Ukrainian journalist who gave a report live, and in that report he said, as a journalist, I need to be impartial, I need to be balanced. Okay, one doesn't have a problem with that. But he said, seeing that the Russians are branding me and Ukrainians Nazis, I'm going to quote from Adolf Eichmann. And he went on to argue that Eichmann said, if you're going to murder people, you need to murder the children, because otherwise they will grow up and seek some kind of revenge or want to avenge the death of their parents. And he said, well, the Ukrainian military cannot murder Russian children because they're bound by international law and rules of law, but I am not part of the military, and therefore I can. And I think it's worth quoting. He said, when I get the chance to take Russian lives, I will not hesitate to do so. I will do everything I can so that neither you nor your children will ever be able to live on this land. And he goes on, I mean, the terminology, you are trash that must be wiped off the face of the planet. And if any Ukrainian has the chance to crash your bones, slit your throat, kill and smother Russians, well, I hope they at least kill one of them. So quite emotive language that I think by any norms would not be acceptable. Much later, he did come forward and apologize, but the apology was to the extent that he said, well, what I said was unacceptable. We are humans. We as Ukrainians are humans. We're not like the Russians who pray for genocide. So even that apology is a little bit questionable. We are seeing the same kind of sentiment being expressed by officials in Kiev. So their statements are not as extreme and not as dramatic. But as you mentioned, this is what the Ukrainian defense minister had to say, and it in itself is quite emotive. Let's take a listen.
Kyiv, one of the most beautiful cities in EU today, looks like a frame of apocalypse movie. Sumy, Kharkiv, Mariupol, it's terrible. This is what the Russian world carries with it. Deaths of people, destruction not only cities but democracy, rights, freedoms. They aren't Slavs, they're orcs. But we'll win.
It was published by the Ukrainian State Body for Historic Research, which one would assume would have some kind of authority. It went so far as to publish 9 arguments that are supposed to ultimately lead to the conclusion that Ukrainians and Russians are not brothers, as everybody likes to say. And it certainly is strange to many people to de facto separate the two nations, because if you look back in history, they really are much more similar than they are different. And he went on with his arguments, and the most interesting one is actually the 9th one, where he spoke about the origins of the differences going back as far as the 7th century, where he made the point that you touched on, that Ukrainians are Slavs, but he said Russians are Slavs and Ugro-Finns. And the conclusion was that Ukrainians are kind of good and Russians are evil. Now, as you can well imagine, there was some kind of response to that from viewers. One said, well, you're pushing this theory that we're pure, you're not pure, and that has throwbacks to the Second World War. Another person saying, well, can you point out physical characteristics that would help me distinguish between a Russian and a Ukraine? And my personal favorite is someone saying, I know you guys are trying really hard not to be Nazis, but I'm going to have to ask you to try a little harder. And following that response, the body added a PS to their 9 arguments, which said that what they meant by pure origin was not that some tribes are better than others, which in itself doesn't seem a very convincing argument, but just that the roots between Ukrainians and Russians are different in terms of folk culture, social traditions, etc. So again, back to the topic of rhetoric, back to the topic of where it leaves us, it certainly is worrying.
Political analyst Nico House believes Washington has been lax in its oversight of who it supports in Ukraine for years.
The U.S. and the NATO powers that are currently assisting Ukraine, accused of being largely ran by Nazis to a large degree, they were known for allowing funding of Nazism. In 2017, the United States Congress thought it was such a big problem, the funding of Nazism in West Ukraine, that they forbade funding Nazis. They literally passed legislation stopping it from happening. Now, clearly that legislation is being ignored. They've kind of been embedded with Nazis this entire time. And oftentimes when the United States and their State Department media arms speak, you find out it's mostly projection. They're truly guilty of what they accuse others of being guilty of. Facebook is saying, well, in the case of calling for violence against Russian soldiers, or even in the case of calling for the literal assassination of another nation's president, well, this is fine. Which once again shows how inconsistent the big tech oligarchy is. They're not applying any type of principles unless it's protect the powers that be of the United States and the West. And when you have world leaders comparing, soldiers to orcs, it's like, so Russian soldiers are orcs, then what would you consider the members of the Azov battalion who are literal Nazis holding Ukrainians and Russians, as human shields in the Donetsk region, in other regions of the Ukraine, like not letting people leave?
Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his virtual address to the US Congress, reiterated his calls for the establishment of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. He also asked for more supplies of air defense systems, but the White House and NATO remain opposed to closing Ukraine's skies, fearing it could lead to an all-out war with Russia.
Allies are united, both in providing support to Ukraine to uphold their right for self-defense, but allies are also united when it comes to that NATO should not deploy forces on the ground or in the airspace over Ukraine. Because we have a responsibility to ensure that this conflict, this war, doesn't escalate beyond Ukraine. We see death, we see destruction, we see human suffering in Ukraine, but this can become even worse if NATO took actions that actually turned this into a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia.
Independent political analyst Gilbert Doctorow believes Ukraine shouldn't put too much reliance on NATO.
Zelensky, in the last couple of days, has said publicly that Ukraine no longer expects to become a member of NATO. It does not mean at the same time that he intends for Ukraine to be isolated from its friends and supporters, and he has made explicit that he expects that some NATO members, meaning particularly Britain, will continue to provide military assistance or training or whatever to Ukraine. So of course, the distinction is that the alliance as such would not be liable in any way for supporting or helping Ukraine in case it found itself in another conflict with Russia.
Vladimir Putin has said the West had defaulted on its obligations to Russia and that freezing Moscow's financial reserves was an illegitimate act.
Now the entire planet has to pay for the ambitions of the West, for their attempts to preserve by any means their world domination. They have increased inflation and increased inequality. We have an influx of refugees all around the world. A heavy blow was dealt to the global economy and trade. Trust in the dollar has been undermined. The illegitimate move to freeze some assets of the Central Bank of Russia draws a line under so-called highly rated assets. Both the US and EU announced a default with regards to their obligations towards Russia, and arresting the asset accounts of companies and individuals serves as a good lesson for everyone, because you should invest in your own country.
Well, that comes as the fate of Russia's sovereign debt repayment, which is worth more than $100 million, rests in the hands of the US, as Moscow is waiting to see whether Washington will accept its payment amid the current crippling sanctions on the country. Russia's external debt currently totals around $480 billion, while the most recent bond payment we've just been talking about is worth $117 million. Since the Russian Central Bank and Finance Ministry are banned from using dollars at the moment, there's a risk of a technical default. But that's different to a typical government default because the country still has the ability to fulfill its obligations, only in alternative payment methods. And that means a technical default will not lead to severe economic or social impacts. And Moscow says shelves will remain stacked and money will still be easily accessible. The country's finance minister again clarified the situation.
On the 14th, on Monday, we sent the corresponding payment with the correct currency. The payment went to the appropriate American bank, which is holding our foreign currency account, including that of our Ministry of Finance. There is a risk that this payment will not reach the final recipients. Namely, we will credit, in this case, rubles to our depository, the National Settlement Depository, and offer to settle our debts in rubles. Russian investors will do it, and foreign investors can do it as well if they accept to receive the corresponding amount in rubles. What does default mean? Default is when obligations cannot be met. The Russian Federation has the necessary amount in foreign currency, and there is an opportunity to pay in ruble settlements. But the actions of Western countries have led to the fact that our foreign currency account is blocked. We have the money. We have given the payment. Now the ball is on the other side, first of all, of the American authorities, who must clarify whether it is possible to or not. But of course, common sense shows that for US investors, such permits should obviously be accepted. So let's see how the situation develops.
Another hostile action that drives Russian-American relations into even more of a dead end. That's how Russia's embassy in the US has described a fourth round of sanctions on the country. But concerns have been raised as to how the measures designed to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine could hurt elsewhere too. With more on this, here's RT's Donald Corter.
Anti-Russian sanctions have seriously backfired on Western economies, and Moscow hasn't even responded in kind. Still, a new package of sanctions from the UK is being rolled out, this time on luxury goods.
The export ban will come into force shortly and will make sure oligarchs and other members of the elite, who have grown rich under President Putin's reign and support his illegal invasion, are deprived of access to luxury goods.
Strong words, especially when essential economic spheres like that of energy are hurting. Who knows what further hikes in the price of gas and oil could mean for the European Union, which was already reeling from an energy crisis. If the West launches more sanctions, we may soon find out.
The prospect of large-scale disruptions to Russian oil production is threatening to create a global oil supply shock. The implications of a potential loss of Russian oil exports to global markets cannot be understated.
It's probably why, over the past 2 weeks, the supply of Russian oil to Europe has significantly increased. That's according to Gazprom. It's risen over 50% in both Italy and Poland, while in Croatia it's more than doubled in comparison to last year. And what if Moscow were to ban exports of raw materials to the West? Russia produces around half of the world's neon, which it supplies to Ukrainian factories, a gas necessary in the production of semiconductors, which are already in deficit globally. The conflict has even disrupted the industry, and sanctions could make the situation worse. But if the flow of Russia's rare metals like palladium and platinum stopped, well, that could be catastrophic.
If we have sanctions and we can't access that palladium, you have to expect disruption globally.
The United States banned the import
of around 600 to 700,000 barrels a day of Russian oil. Till now, they haven't managed to find an alternative for that. By the end of this year, we would be reaching a level of constriction in the market or deficit to the extent that prices are bound to rise. If the West continues with the sanctions on Russia, I think we will see a breakdown in the global economy.
So the West got tired of barking and tried to go in for a bite, but to little avail. Perhaps the EU and UK and US just aren't as powerful as they once were.
Now the entire planet has to pay for the ambitions of the West, for their attempts to preserve by any means their world domination.
With the world's reliance on Russian resources leaving the US and its European allies in a bit of an awkward situation, it may be only a matter of time before Western leaders realize that diplomacy is a better option than sanctions.
Meanwhile, fuel prices have been pushed to record highs in Europe. And in a bid to mitigate the impact on consumers, the EU has now agreed to subsidise households and companies hardest hit by the spike in energy costs. However, in Spain, the soaring fuel costs seeing fishermen choose to keep their boats moored firmly in port.
This week we have already decided to stop because there has been another increase in the price of fuel, which means that we practically would have had to take money out of our pockets to go to work.
We cannot put the cost of going to sea onto the price of the fish because we depend on an auction when we arrive at port. We sell the fish at an auction, which is a downside, as we cannot increase any kind of price for the fish we sell. Therefore, whether diesel is cheap or expensive, it will not be affected in the final price of the shrimp or fish that we catch.
Already tense relations between the US and China could be ratcheted up further. Beijing says it will take strong countermeasures if Washington decides to slap sanctions on the country over its unwillingness to follow all the measures currently being placed on Russia.
On the one hand, the United States seeks China's support and cooperation, and on the other hand, it brandishes the big stick of sanctions against China. This will not work. We urge the U.S. not to damage China's legitimate rights and interests in any form. If the U.S. continues alone down this path, China will certainly take strong countermeasures.
Beijing's words came after Washington said it would create significant consequences for China if it did not follow the U.S. sanctions policy. Washington's also claiming Moscow has already requested military and financial assistance from Beijing, and that's something that China has outright rejected as disinformation. China's foreign minister says the country wants to avoid any sanctions over the conflict because it has no part to play in it. Meanwhile, China analyst Victor Gao believes any sanctions from the US on the world's largest economy will have dire consequences for the rest of the world.
Whatever threat coming out from Washington will be disregarded by China at this very important moment because, first of all, it is wrong for the United States to impose sanctions on China, especially because China has followed a very important position of neutrality, urging all parties to de-escalate and seek a peaceful resolution of the conflicts in Ukraine. And secondly, China is the largest manufacturing country in the world. Any sanctions against China will not succeed on the one hand and will be suicidal to start with. It will really push global economic growth into recession, and it will be against the fundamental interests not only of the Chinese people, but also of the American people. So I think Ms. Psaki or whatever need to have second thoughts as to what they are up to, whether they really want to promote global peace and development, or whether they want to wreck the boat of international economic development.
Well, that's all for this hour. For all the latest developments on the conflict in Ukraine, head over to RT.com. My name's Peter Scott, and thank you for watching.